In this lecture, we're going to talk a bit about the various steps we need to take to write up the findings that we have accumulated through our research process. So as many of you know, a lot of what goes into developing a research question and trying to ask and answer that research question really center on, well, what does the literature say? What does the academic literature say about this relationship between X and Y, or X1, X2, X3, and Y? So that necessarily means that we're spending a lot of time figuring out what the literature actually says. So first off, where do we search? We have to begin somewhere. Oftentimes we can rely on something like a university library website through their databases. We can even use things like Google Scholar, which I have used plenty of times. So that's the where. And then we have a how. And the how is, well, let's say we're interested in social ties and protest participation. How do we figure out the literature on those topics? Well, we have to do Boolean searches. This topic and another topic, or this topic or another topic. So I would say something like social ties in quotation marks and protests. And then we can do something called a snowball search. And a snowball search is usually based on an initial search. Let's say you find a first article on social ties and protest participation. You start reading through the article and you realize, well, this article that they're citing in this initial article just keeps popping up. What you can do is look at that citation, go to the references pages, get the name of that article, and then look up that article that your initial article was referencing. So once you look up that article, then you can start reading that second article. And once you start reading the second article, maybe you're going to start finding more references that are cited more and more. So then you use those as a jumping off point for finding a third, fourth, and fifth article. So snowball searching is beginning with one and snowballing out to find related cited articles in academic books. This is for academic literature, not just any literature or any discussion of the topics that you're interested in. We're really trying to get academic literature. This is why I say rely on a university website through their databases or Google Scholar. So I have an example. If we wanted to look at something like criminal behavior amongst female college students, the way we would look at articles or books about criminal behavior among female college students, we would say, let's search for the word crime and the word female and the word college students, or even just students. And you see how it's broken down there. Crime in quotation marks, then and, which tells the search engine that I want the first word and the following word and the following word. So any article that includes all three of those words. Let's say you find one article and it's talking about crime, but nowhere in that journal article does it say the word female or college students. Specifically in this search term, you'd say only find me the articles or academic books that say crime and they say female and they say the words college students. So articles just about crime aren't going to pop up. So you're going to have a much smaller set of articles that are going to populate given this search. We can take an alternative to that. We can say, instead of saying crime and female and college students, we could say crime or female or college students. We can see by replacing and with or, we're going to get a larger set of articles. What's going to happen is it'll find the articles that just talk about crime, and it's going to find articles that say the word female but also talk about a bunch of other things. And it's going to find articles that mention college students but also talk about other things. So it's not really looking at the relationship between crime and sex and being a college student. It's looking at these various keywords in isolation. That's going to give you a lot more articles. If we wanted to look at something like cohabitation among gay and lesbian couples, we'd say something like gay or lesbian and cohabit. So we see gay or lesbian, we're not saying gay and lesbian. Why do we do that? It's because we want articles just about gay individuals. We want articles just about lesbian individuals, but both are going to be coupled with this idea of cohabitation. So it's going to find gay and cohabitation and lesbian and cohabitation. So you see how these are going to be two separate sets of characteristics. So it's basically just coming through and saying, find me articles that mention gay and cohabit, and find me articles that say lesbian and cohabit. So this or is just saying create a larger set or create separate sets. And finally here where we see cohabit, I want to look at cohabitation, but I say cohabit with a little asterisk. So what that means is it's going to find the stem cohabit. So it could be cohabit, it could be cohabitate, it could be cohabitation, it could be all of those various iterations of the stem cohabit. So it's going to find gay and cohabitate, gay and cohabit, gay and cohabitation, lesbian and cohabit, lesbian and cohabitate, lesbian, and cohabitation. So it's going to give you a larger set of characteristics. Two of these words are going to be linked by the operator and. Reading is an important part of this. You can't just go in and find the literature and then just move on. We have to actually read what these articles are saying. So when you're reading journal articles, they're generally around 15 to 30 pages, and you may identify an article based on other things that you read. You say, oh, they keep citing this article, I'm going to read it. So you download it and you start reading through it. The problem is reading an academic article may be frustrating. And why is that? Well, it's because when we're reading academic articles, we're reading for a purpose. We're reading to learn something. We're reading to learn about what the researcher studied and how it relates to our own work. We're trying to incorporate this article or its findings into our research. How much does what they did in this article, how much does it fit with my research? Or is it completely different from mine? Or are they studying something completely different that doesn't really relate to the thing that I'm interested in for my research? So if you go in with that purpose in mind, you may run into the issue of, wow, I just spent an hour reading this 30-page article, and then you realize it had nothing to do with the research question that you're asking, so you can't even incorporate it into your work. That's not an efficient manner of reading the literature. Instead, there's a really quick way to figure out how an academic article fits with your work. You can very quickly decide, should I read the whole thing or should I just move on and find another article? So the way you do it is first read the abstract. Every journal article is going to have an abstract at the front end. It summarizes what's going on in that article. It tells you what variables it used, what kind of method, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, what their research question is, how things are measured, and their general findings. That is usually between 100 and 200 words, so it gives you a nice snapshot or synopsis of what's going on in the article. Imagine going to a research article and reading the abstract and figuring out, wow, this doesn't relate to my research question. Then you can move on from that article. That took you, a minute, 2 minutes to figure out that it didn't fit, rather than reading the whole article and then realizing after you've lost those 2 hours that it doesn't fit. So reading the abstract is the best part. You do a quick decision. Does this fit? Does it not? If you determine that it definitely fits, or it sort of fits, or it's kind of on the edge, you can proceed with the next step, which is reading the introduction and the conclusion/discussion. So you read the intro, see how they set it up. In the intro, they're going to talk about the statement of the problem. They're going to state what the research problem is, both empirically and practically. How does this work on the ground? Why is this important for the average everyday reader, not just researchers? It'll briefly touch on their findings. Then, to get a better explanation of what they found, you go to the conclusion and discussion. And the conclusion and discussion are actually just glossing over those findings, reiterating what they found, what the effects were, what they mean, and their own interpretation of those findings. And the discussion will also incorporate a narrative about how their findings fit or go against everything they've found in the literature. So they may find we had this relationship between social ties and protest participation. Other literature doesn't really focus on it, but we focused on it and we see that it has a large effect on protest participation. What you're getting from that is, wow, I've been thinking social ties matter this whole time, but this person said it's not even out there in the literature, and they're one of the first researchers to actually investigate it and show that yes, it does matter. So the conclusion will give you a good synopsis of what their findings are, explaining them and interpreting them, and then explaining how those findings fit within the larger literature. Then after you've read those and figured out, okay, good, this will definitely fit with my research, by that time you'll figure out if this definitely fits with your research. If it does, then you can skim the article. So you note the section headings, you'll look at the tables, you'll look at the graphs, and you'll say, okay, what are they talking about? Do they cite anybody I know already? Okay, what do their tables look like? Are they descriptive? Are they inferential? What kind of modeling techniques did they use? Were they using regressions, meaning they're using multivariate techniques, or are they using bivariate techniques? And then you can skim over how they're measuring their variables. Are they quantitative? Are they qualitative variables? How are they defining these variables? And it can give you some insight into the ways in which you should be defining your variables and analyzing your data. Then you can read the article in its entirety. So you go through and just read the whole thing. But that's after you've decided it matters to your research, that the findings matter both empirically and practically, and then you've skimmed the article. With academic books, it's a little bit different. Books are 200, 300, 400, 500, 600 pages sometimes, and you don't really have the time to invest a lot of energy in reading an entire book to see if it fits. So best way of doing it is that similar process. Read the preface, or the introduction of the book to see, okay, are they talking about things that I think are related to my research topic? Then, if you've decided after reading those 10, 15 pages that yes, it fits, then you can move on and read the conclusion of the book. What are their general findings? They're going to have to go one by one and explain everything that they covered in these various chapters and how they relate to the literature, how they relate to the specific research question, and you can get a sense of where does this fit for my research question. Next, you can proceed to read the intros and conclusions for each relevant chapter. So not just the intro of the book and the conclusion of the book, but the intro and conclusion of each chapter. So like chapter 2, read the intro and conclusion. That'll give you a setup for what's going on in that chapter, as well as what are they arguing for that chapter. And then read the book in its entirety. You don't necessarily have to read the book in its entirety. It is a good practice, but sometimes you might be looking for how they measured this one thing, and I'm trying to get a sense of how other people are measuring it. You may just need to investigate one chapter, read the intro, conclusion, or read that whole chapter and say, okay, this is how they measured it. It fits with how other people are measuring that same variable, so I'm going to measure it that way for my own research. When you're evaluating this research literature, whether it's a journal article or an academic book, you need to figure out a bunch of things. What are the author's theoretical orientations? How did they design the study? Are they doing a qualitative, quantitative study? Are they doing surveys? Are they doing content analysis? Are they doing interviews, experiments? Right? All of these are important. Then think about their measurement. How are they measuring their variables? What are their research questions? Are they developing theory from the ground up, or are they developing theory based on existing theory that's out there and they're sort of testing those theories? Think about their sampling techniques. Are they using populations, or are they using samples? If they're using samples, do they describe how they collected that sample? And then the methods that they're using for analysis. Next, it's very important to start thinking about how we're going to use the internet to find these sources. I've already said you should probably use your library website. You should be really relying on high quality sources from like Google Scholar or your library website. If you're writing up research and you want to use examples for a relationship, like you're studying your own relationship between social ties and protest participation, but there have been studies out there or surveys that look at that relationship, you can use those surveys or studies as examples, but make sure you're only relying on those high quality sources. So examples are data that are coming from nationally recognized newspapers such as LA Times, New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal. You may instead want to rely on government or bureaucratic websites, anything that ends in .gov, Census website, CDC, World Bank, CIA, human mortality data set. So make sure you're relying on really high quality sources when you're writing these things up, when you're using data to just demonstrate a relationship as an example, or you're looking for various sources. In addition, we're going to be using the internet to find the literature, find the data. Sometimes you may have to rely on a website to get some information instead of an actual published article. So maybe you're going to the Pew website to get some trend data to see how many people support legalization of marijuana over time. We know that Pew, Gallup, and all of these research firms do a good job in terms of their research methodology. They're reliable, they're accurate data sources. But you just kind of want to report what they've reported. So instead of citing an actual academic article, which they sometimes don't write, they have a website with actual data up there, so you can actually cite those websites. You have to be sort of cognizant about the quality of the website. You have to ask yourself, who or what is the author of the website? Is it a research firm, or is it a person? Are they advocating a particular point of view? Are they trying to push propaganda? Are they trying to push a right-leaning or left-leaning point of view? Or are they trying to report? Does the website give accurate and complete references, meaning if they're saying that this is a relationship, that this is why they're studying it, and it's based on previous research, are they citing those references? See if the data are up to date. Are the data official? Is it a university research site, or is it a private research site? Sometimes they do advocate for a particular political point of view to sway people to believe one view or another based on how they've collected the data. So it's important to ask not only the point of view, but are they a research website? Are they affiliated with a university? Or how can we ensure that they're being objective in their research process? And then finally, you want to compare. You want to see, do the data that they're presenting or the arguments that they're presenting, do they seem consistent with data and arguments from other sites? You could look at Pew and how they report support for legalization of marijuana, and then look at Gallup and see how they report it. and then look at New York Times if they have a survey on legalization of marijuana and see how they all either fit with one another or various points difference between all of those, or if they're drastically different. And then here I've listed and linked the crap test and fake news. So when we're looking at websites for data and maybe arguments, theories, and hypotheses, we need to figure out if this is an actual good website. And to do that, I've linked that resource for evaluating whether or not a site is good. When you're writing social research, make sure that you're using proper grammar and spelling, right? This isn't texting, this isn't emailing, so make sure that you're using full sentences, proper grammar, proper spelling, things like the Oxford comma, right? So keep those in mind when you're writing. Make sure that you're using a citation style guide from either the American Sociological Association or American Psychological Association. It'll tell you how in-text citations are supposed to look, how references are supposed to look, how tables and graphs are supposed to look. Here in the notes, I've linked to the OWL website through Purdue, and it gives you a list of various citation styles that you can follow. So instead of going out and actually buying the APA or ASA style guide, you can just find them online. And then importantly, avoiding plagiarism. It's important because when we're working in the research realm, we're presenting others' research. But when we're presenting others' research to kind of set up our own arguments, presenting other articles and what they found, we can't simply just copy and paste what they wrote. Oftentimes it's better to paraphrase what the authors in that article said. So plagiarism, we should all know, it's presenting someone else's words or thoughts as if they are your own. This means that you're engaging in intellectual theft, and we don't want to do that. We want to give credit where credit's due. We're standing on the shoulders of giants, so we want to make sure that those people are given that credit. So when you're saying, authors have found that social ties and protest participation are tightly linked, you don't want to just say that as an open statement. You want to say, well, who said that? Who are the authors who say that that is a real thing, a real relationship? So you have to cite them in text and in your references. So again, follow the ASA, APA style guide for information on that. When you're writing up the social research, you have various sections of the final report. The final report could be a journal article, it could be a sort of a research report, like an executive summary or something like that. But they generally have a similar breakdown. So we have introduction. You should outline the research question, why it's important, talk about what the research question is, what do we know about variable X, why it logically relates to variable Y, and what does this relationship between X and Y, what does it exemplify? What does it show us? What does it mean? Then you review the literature, your research question in the context of existing scientific knowledge. That means, what are other authors saying about this relationship? Has there been a lot done on those relationships or that relationship, or is there not a lot? You're one of the first to investigate this relationship. I will point out that you should be careful when you're reviewing the literature and you're making these claims about your research question fitting or not fitting within existing literature. And I say that you should proceed with caution, because oftentimes you'll spend maybe an hour or two pouring through the literature on a topic, looking for articles that talk about your specific topic, but then you'll find very little or sometimes find nothing. And then you'll say, well, look, there's nothing out there. Listen, people have been doing research for hundreds of years, thousands, and there's bound to be something written about your topic. So it's key to sort of take a step back and realize that maybe the research that's been done on your topic hasn't particularly investigated the exact X and the exact Y that you're interested in. But what you can start thinking of is how your X variable fits into a class of X variables, and how your Y variable fits into a class of Y variables. That way you can get to a meta stage and say, okay, what does the literature say about this type of X variable and this type of Y variable? For example, I might say friendships are important for protest participation, meaning having friends go to protest events is very important for protest participation. So I'm saying friendships, the X variable, is related to protest participation, the Y variable. And then I start looking and I don't see anything about friendships. I see protest participation, I see family members talked about, I see classmates talked about, I see colleagues talked about, but I don't see anybody talking about the relationship between friendships or friends and protest participation. Well, what that means is few people have studied exactly friendships. They're generally talking about this class of variables that fit into this larger meta category of social ties. So you can take a step back and say, well, friendship is just a type of social tie. Just like classmates, that's a social tie. Family members, that's another social tie. Colleagues, that's another social tie. Mentors, that's another social tie. So then if you take a step back and start reviewing the literature, instead of looking at the relationship between friendships and protest, and instead you start looking at social ties and protest, a lot more might come up. So it's important to take that into consideration before you quit too soon and say, well, there's no literature out there. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, you may end up searching for days and weeks and months trying to figure out everything that's written about a topic. Chances are, because there's been so much literature written about various topics over the years, you're never going to read everything that's been written. So what we have is this technique in social sciences called saturation. You read to the point where people are starting to say redundant stuff. So you'll read one article talking about friendships, one article talking about social ties generally, one talking about family members, others talking about classmates, all of these things, and you keep reading until the point where you're like, well, most of these articles are saying the same thing, that there is a relationship between various types of social ties and protests. So you read to where you feel like you've saturated or accumulated or soaked up enough information about that topic that you can speak eloquently about it. It's the same process in qualitative research. You get out into the field, and let's say you don't have a hard number of cases that you want to interview, and then you interview somebody and they say, this is my experience with living in Southern California. And then you talk to another participant, they say, this is their experience. And then after about the 30th or 40th interview, you start realizing, okay, they're sort of all hitting on the same things. And after enough time, you'll realize, okay, most people are going to start talking about, feeling happy about the sun, but not going to the beach. So that's the point at which you sort of reached saturation, and you can kind of take a step back and say, okay, I don't need to be in the field and collect more data because they're all sort of saying the same thing at this point, or they're saying generally similar things. We have study design, data methods. So you're going to focus on, are you talking about the population, or are you talking about a sample? If you're talking about a sample, what's the sampling frame? How did you sample? So what is the method of sampling? What's the sample size? How did you collect the data? How many people are you giving surveys, and how many people completed the survey? And then the methods of data processing, coding, and analysis. Did you field an online survey? Was it an in-person survey? How were the surveys processed? Did you type them into Excel one by one, or if it was an online survey, or the data automatically recorded from their responses? Next, you want to focus on what kind of analysis you're going to be doing. Are you doing bivariate analysis? If so, what kind of bivariate analysis? Are you doing multivariate? Well, what kind of multivariate? Next, you actually analyze the data and then you interpret it, right? So you actually run those bivariate or multivariate tests and then say, okay, this is what I found. And then you interpret what you found through the analysis. X is related to Y, right? So we found an association, we have time ordering, but we don't have the absence of spuriousness because I only looked at a bivariate relationship. Well, then the next step is to move on to multivariate relationships and see, can I include variables that would remove the possibility of spuriousness? And then we can get closer to causality in this social science research. And then in the summary and conclusions or discussion conclusions, you want to review your findings, but you're only going to be reviewing your main findings. If you have a multivariate test, you're going to be running 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 100 different variables against a Y variable, well, against one another, and then against a Y variable simultaneously. You don't want to walk through and say, this variable was non-significantly related to the outcome. This next variable was non-significantly related to the outcome, right? You don't want to do all that. What you really want to do is review all the main findings. What is your general research question, as you've defined in the intro, and how did you either find support for that relationship or did not find support for that relationship? So really, you're going to be reviewing the significant findings in the context of the larger project. Next, you're going to talk about some of the shortcomings and make some suggestions for future research. Once you've done that, the next step is going public. So you send it to an advisor or a mentor or a knowledgeable scholar to give you feedback to improve that work. So you're going to give feedback from others on your paper that you wrote about this research question. After you've gotten that feedback, you incorporate that feedback and you could submit as a report to an organization, or you can submit for conference presentations, or you can submit to an academic journal or press. And that's how you go about presenting your research. It's very important when you're engaging in the research process to move beyond just having your own data and analyzing it, but to actually send it out for others to read, because that's the whole point. We're investigating this research question for a point, so we want others to see it.